You are entirely useless to this business, Eugene, and I want you out of my kitchen right now. The clatter of silverware against porcelain from the main dining room bled through the heavy swinging doors. The cold steel of the prep counter bit into my palms as I gripped the edge. A sharp scent of burnt rosemary hung in the hot air, a mistake the new line cook made just seconds before Lauren stormed in. Lauren stood directly under the harsh fluorescent lights. She clutched a leather-bound clipboard against her expensive silk dress. Her knuckles were white. I was just showing the new boy how to calibrate the commercial oven, I said. My voice stayed low and steady. 40 years of teaching vocational mechanics had taught me never to yell over a tantrum. You lose the room the moment you raise your voice. The thermostat runs hot. At 68, I have a little more experience with these temperamental old models. I do not care about your age or your dusty teaching career, Lauren snapped, her voice echoing off the tile walls. This is a high-end restaurant, not one of your charity community workshops. You are in the way. I looked at David. My son stood exactly 2 feet behind his wife. He wore the dark, tailored suit Lauren had picked out for tonight, the 5-year anniversary celebration of their restaurant group. David kept his head down. He studied a scuff mark on his Italian leather shoes, pretending the intricate tile pattern was the most fascinating thing in the world. He did not say a single word. He is just trying to help, Lauren, a quiet voice muttered from the prep station. It was one of the young line cooks, a boy I had taught to rebuild car engines 3 years ago in the high school shop class. Lauren spun around. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor. Did I ask you to speak? Keep your mouth shut and prep the lamb, or you can find another job tonight. Do you understand me? The kitchen went dead silent. The low hum of the walk-in freezer suddenly sounded deafening. 7 cooks and prep workers stared at the cutting boards in front of them. Lauren turned back to me. Her perfume, something heavy and floral, overpowered the smell of the rosemary and the roasting meat. I tolerate you at the Sunday dinner table, Eugene. But you come in here, pretending you know how to run things, acting like you actually matter to my staff. You are living off David's success. You contribute absolutely nothing. I want you to go out the back door so the important investors in the front do not have to look at you. I waited for my son to look up. Just a glance. A single syllable to defend the man who had raised him alone since he was 10 years old. David adjusted his cuffs, clearing his throat. Maybe it is best you go home, Dad. It is a big night for the corporate sponsors. Lauren is under a massive amount of stress. That was it, the final verdict, delivered by my own flesh and blood. I wiped my hands on a spare towel, folded it into a perfect square, and placed it carefully on the metal counter. I will get my coat. The back hallway felt freezing compared to the kitchen. I took my worn tweed jacket off the brass hook by the staff lockers. Through the small rectangular window in the swinging doors, I could see the warm glow of the main dining room. Flashbulbs went off in rapid succession. Guests were recording the anniversary toasts on their phones. One woman in a bright red dress stood dangerously close to the kitchen doors. Her phone was angled directly at the glass pane. She was recording the argument. I pulled my collar up and pushed open the heavy exit door. The night air carried the sharp chill of late October. I walked past the towering metal dumpsters, stepping over a shallow puddle that reflected the flickering streetlights of the alley. Wait, Eugene, please, wait. Footsteps splashed through the damp alley behind me. I stopped and turned around. Raymond, Lauren's father, and the primary financial backer of the entire restaurant corporation, jogged toward me. His heavy breathing sounded ragged in the cold air. He wore a crisp tuxedo, looking completely out of place among the stained brick walls and overflowing trash bins. Raymond caught up, resting a hand on his knee to catch his breath. The street lamp illuminated the deep lines on his forehead. I saw what happened from the hallway, Raymond said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I am so sorry. I do not know what has gotten into her lately. The pressure of this expansion, maybe. Your daughter made herself very clear, Raymond, I said, and my son completely agreed with her. Raymond stood up straight. He looked at my frayed jacket collar, then down at the grease stains lingering on my hands. He swallowed hard. The wealthy corporate investor, the man who owned half the commercial real estate in the downtown district, suddenly looked exactly like a frightened teenager caught making a terrible mistake. Sorry, teacher, Raymond said quietly. She was incredibly rude. I nodded once, offering no absolution. Good night, Raymond. He stood there in the alley as I turned and continued walking. Before I could reach the corner to the main street, the heavy metal door of the kitchen opened again. 3 kitchen workers slipped out into the freezing cold. They still wore their white aprons, shivering almost immediately. The tallest one, a young man who used to stay late after my classes to fix his little sister's broken bicycle, stepped forward. He reached into his pocket and handed me a small package wrapped tightly in aluminum foil. "The head chef made the brisket you like, Mr. Mercer," the boy said softly. The other two young men nodded, their eyes fixed on the wet pavement. "Thank you, boys," I said, taking the warm package. "Get back inside before she notices you are gone." "Mr. Mercer," the tall boy said, his voice tight and trembling. "She took our overtime pay again this week, and the tips from the weekend shifts." I stopped moving. The foil package radiated heat against my cold palm. "What did you say?" "She alters the time cards in the system," the boy whispered, looking back over his shoulder at the heavy door. "She has been doing it for months. We thought you knew. We thought that was why you were always back here, keeping an eye on things for us." I stood perfectly still in the damp alley, listening to the distant sounds of clinking glasses and polite applause echoing from the dining room. Lauren had just humiliated me in front of my own son. She called me a useless old man. She thought she held all the power in the world. She had no idea that half her kitchen staff were my former students. She certainly did not know that her primary investor still called me teacher. I looked at the young men shivering in the cold night. These were men I had taught to build things, to fix broken machinery, to stand up for their own dignity. "I did not know," I said, my grip tightening on the package. "But I do now. Go back inside. Keep your heads down. I will take care of this." The sun cut through the kitchen blinds, warming the scratched wood of my table. My coffee had gone cold an hour ago. I stared at the dark liquid, listening to the relentless buzzing of my cell phone against the counter. It vibrated twice, paused, and started again. I picked up the device. 32 missed messages. None of them were from David. I had stayed awake until 3 in the morning waiting for my son to call, hoping he would explain why he stood silently while his wife threw me out of their restaurant. Instead, the screen was filled with names I had not seen in years. Marcus Vance, Sarah Jenkins, Thomas Keller, my former students. Marcus had sent a link with a short message. "Teacher, look at this." I tapped the screen. A video player loaded, filling the quiet kitchen with Lauren's sharp voice. "You are entirely useless to this business, Eugene, and I want you out of my kitchen right now." The camera angle was shaky. Someone had recorded it from the dining room. It caught my silence, David staring at his shoes, and the exact moment I turned and walked out the back door. Below the video, a small counter showed 50,000 views. A heavy knock rattled my front door. I set the phone down and walked down the short hallway. Marcus stood on the porch. The boy I taught to weld 20 years ago was now a massive man with grease-stained hands and 3 successful auto repair shops across the city. "Get your coat, Mr. Mercer," Marcus said. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, bringing the smell of motor oil and cold morning air with him. "I have 6 tow trucks sitting at the shop. We are going to drive down to that restaurant, park them across the delivery alley, and make sure they do not get a single supply truck for a week." "Take your boots off, Marcus," I said quietly, "and keep your voice down. The neighbors do not need to hear you planning a traffic blockade." The mechanic let out a harsh breath, but he kicked off his heavy boots. He followed me into the kitchen, his large frame making the small room feel crowded. He pointed a thick finger at my phone on the table. "She humiliated you in front of the whole city," Marcus said. "My nephew washes dishes in that kitchen. He called me at dawn. He said the old man in the tuxedo chased you out into the alley." "Who was the guy in the suit?" I poured the cold coffee down the sink, turning the faucet on to wash away the bitter smell. "His name is Raymond," I explained, watching the dark liquid swirl down the drain. "Long before he bought half the commercial real estate downtown, he was a hungry teenager living in a rusted station wagon. I caught him trying to pry copper wiring out of the vocational center basement 38 years ago. Instead of calling the police, I handed him a broom and a set of blueprints." Marcus stopped pacing. He leaned against the counter, crossing his massive arms. "So you built the father, and the daughter treats you like garbage. Does she know?" "Lauren has no idea who I am to her father," I said. "And she certainly does not know that half her kitchen staff used to sit in my classroom." Before Marcus could respond, my phone vibrated again. The screen flashed a number I had saved just last night in the freezing alley. It was Elias, the tall line cook who had handed me the foil package of brisket. I pressed the speaker button and set the phone on the table. The sound of clattering pans and hushed, panicked voices filled the room. "Mr. Mercer," Elias whispered. His breathing sounded shallow and fast. "Are you watching the internet?" "I saw the video, Elias," I replied. I pulled out a wooden chair and sat down. "Are you at the restaurant right now?" I am hiding in the walk-in pantry, the young cook said. Lauren is losing her mind. The manager pulled the entire morning prep team into the dining room. She demanded to check our phones to see who recorded the argument. Marcus stepped closer to the table, his jaw tightening as he listened. Did anyone give her their phone? I asked. No, Elias answered, because none of us filmed it. A customer did. But she does not care about the truth. She just wants someone to punish. She told us that if the person who leaked the video does not confess by noon, she will cut our hourly pay for the rest of the month to make up for the public relations damage. The sheer audacity of the threat settled heavily in the room. My daughter-in-law was using her own public cruelty to justify further theft from vulnerable kids. Teacher, Elias said, his voice dropping so low I had to lean forward to hear him. 5 of the guys in the kitchen were your students. We trust you, but we need to know why you let her do it. I frowned, looking across the table at Marcus. Let her do what, Elias? The payroll, the young man whispered. She alters the time cards in the computer system. She deletes our overtime hours before the corporate accounting department sees them. We thought you knew. We thought that was why you were always in the kitchen, keeping an eye on things, waiting for the right moment to catch her. The room went completely still. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. The puzzle pieces suddenly slammed into place. The high turnover rate, the tired faces of the prep cooks, Lauren constantly bragging at Sunday dinners about keeping labor costs miraculously low. She was not a genius manager. She was stealing from her own staff. I did not know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Elias, I swear to you, I had no idea. A long exhale came through the speaker, the sound of immense relief. I told them, Elias said. I told the guys you would never let her steal from us if you knew. You want me to bring the trucks now? Marcus asked loudly. No, I told the mechanic. I leaned closer to the phone. Elias, listen to me very carefully. Do not argue with her today. Do not try to defend me. You need to keep your head down and do exactly what she says for the rest of your shift. We want to walk out right now, Elias argued, a desperate edge creeping into his words. We cannot just stand here and let her treat people like this. Walking out without a plan accomplishes absolutely nothing, I instructed, using the exact tone I reserved for students about to make a dangerous mistake with a table saw. If you quit today, she keeps your stolen wages, and she replaces you with someone else she can exploit. We do not run away. We fix the underlying problem. The line went quiet for a moment, save for the hum of the pantry refrigerator in the background. What do you want us to do? Elias finally asked. I need you to gather the kitchen staff, I said. Only the ones you trust, the ones who know me. Tell them to finish their shift quietly. When the restaurant closes tonight, I want all of you to come to my house. We will need proof, Marcus added, leaning over my shoulder. Can you get into the computer system? She locks the manager office, Elias replied. But we have our printed schedule slips. And some of the guys took pictures of their punch-out screens on their phones last week, right before the hours disappeared. Bring everything you have, I said. Use my back gate tonight. Make sure nobody follows you. I ended the call and pushed the phone across the scratched wood. Sunlight continued to pour through the kitchen window, bright and unforgiving. The humiliation from the previous night no longer mattered. My son had married a woman who built her pristine public empire on the stolen labor of my students. Marcus pulled out the chair opposite me and sat down heavily. He cracked his knuckles, a slow, deliberate sound in the quiet kitchen. What is the plan, teacher? I looked at the cold sink, thinking of Raymond, of David, and of the young men currently hiding in a pantry out of fear. We are going to build a case, I said, and then we are going to take her apart. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight. Rain lashed against the kitchen window, blurring the glow of the street lamp outside. My back gate groaned on its rusty hinges, and seconds later, a heavy knock rattled the wooden door. I turned the deadbolt and let the cold air spill into the room. Elias stepped inside first. He kept his head down, water dripping from the hood of his dark jacket. 4 other young men followed him, bringing the sharp smell of commercial bleach and stale cooking oil into my house. None of them spoke. They looked exhausted, their shoulders slumped under the weight of a 14-hour shift. Marcus closed the door behind them and locked it. Put everything on the table, I said quietly, pulling out a chair. The boys reached into their pockets. Crumpled receipts, faded time cards, and folded schedule printouts piled up on the scratched wood. Elias pulled out his cell phone, tapping the screen before placing it next to a small stack of paper slips. This is my punch-out record from last Tuesday, the young cook explained, his voice tight with anxiety. 14 hours. But look at the bank deposit on the screen. The accounting department only paid me for 8. I picked up the worn slip of paper, adjusting my glasses to read the faded ink. Then I looked at the bright digital numbers on his phone. The math was not just wrong, it was deliberately severed. I moved down the line of workers, comparing their printed schedules to their final pay stubs. Every single one of them had a massive gap between the hours they worked and the money they actually received. "She is shaving the overtime," Marcus observed, leaning over the table with his arms crossed. The massive mechanic picked up a handful of receipts, his jaw tight. "She waits until you clock out, and then she goes into the computer and erases anything over 40 hours. If we complain to the corporate office, she will fire us," a quiet kid named Julian whispered. He used to sit in the front row of my engine repair class, always too shy to ask a question. Lauren told us the parent company does not care about kitchen staff. She said her father owns the whole building and he would ruin our lives if we tried to sue them. A hard knock sounded at the front door. Julian flinched, stepping back from the table. The other boys froze, their eyes darting toward the hallway. "Relax," Marcus said, pulling a heavy set of keys from his pocket. "I made a phone call while you were on your way over." The mechanic walked down the hall and opened the front door. A moment later, Raymond stepped into the harsh light of my kitchen. The wealthy investor wore a long wool coat over a simple sweater, looking completely exhausted. His eyes swept over the 5 terrified young men standing in my kitchen and then settled on the pile of documents covering the table. "Marcus told me you were holding a meeting, teacher," Raymond said, his voice barely above a rough whisper. "He said I needed to see exactly how my daughter runs my business." I gestured to the scattered papers. "Take a look, Raymond. You are the financial backer of that restaurant. You tell me what you see." Raymond stepped forward slowly. He picked up Elias's time card, comparing it to the digital bank records still glowing on the phone screen. For a long time, the older man said absolutely nothing. He just kept picking up piece after piece of paper, reading the names, checking the dates, and verifying the missing wages. His hands started to shake. "There is a code printed at the bottom of these adjusted slips," Raymond finally said, pointing a trembling finger at a small string of letters. "LM01. That is the general manager override code. That is Lauren." "She did not even try to hide it," I pointed out, watching the devastation settle over Raymond's face. "She assumed these boys were too uneducated to check the math, and too frightened to say anything if they did." Raymond dropped the papers onto the table like they were burning his hands. He looked at Elias, then at Julian, taking in their worn clothes and tired eyes. The powerful corporate owner looked sick to his stomach. "38 years ago, you caught me stealing copper wire because I was hungry," Raymond said, looking directly at me. His voice cracked, thick with unshed tears. "You taught me that a real man builds things up. He does not tear other people down to get ahead. I built an entire corporation on that lesson." He turned his attention back to the stolen wages. "And my own daughter has turned my restaurant into a sweatshop. She betrayed everything you taught me." "We need to stop her," Marcus stated bluntly, "before she ruins anyone else." "We will," Raymond promised, standing up straight. The grief in his eyes was rapidly transforming into a cold, terrifying anger. "My corporate lawyers cannot touch this because it is a conflict of interest. But I know a ruthless labor attorney in the city. We are going to take these documents to him tomorrow morning. We will file a formal complaint with the state labor board, and we will demand a full audit of the payroll system." The kitchen went quiet as the weight of that promise settled over the room. For the first time in months, the young men around the table actually looked hopeful. We had the time cards, we had the bank records, we had the financial backer of the company standing on our side. Then, Elias's cell phone vibrated violently against the wood. The screen lit up, illuminating the dark kitchen. A text message notification flashed across the glass. It was a group message sent to the entire kitchen staff, and the sender name was Lauren Mercer. I leaned over the table and read the glowing words out loud. "The health inspector is coming tomorrow afternoon. No one clocks in until the deep cleaning is finished. If the kitchen is not spotless by noon, do not bother showing up for the anniversary weekend." Marcus let out a low curse. Raymond stared at the screen in pure disgust. Lauren was ordering them to perform heavy manual labor completely off the clock, putting her own illegal demands in writing. We did not just have a case anymore. We had the exact weapon we needed to destroy her empire. The heavy rain from the previous night had faded into a cold, clinging mist by the time we reached the downtown legal district. Raymond pushed open the thick glass doors of a towering commercial building, and we took the elevator up in complete silence. He had called his personal corporate attorney at dawn, refusing to wait a single minute longer. Now, we were sitting in a private boardroom, that smelled of expensive leather, polished mahogany, and bitter black coffee. Arthur, a sharp labor attorney wearing a perfectly tailored suit, spread Elias's printed schedule slips across the wide table. The lawyer did not ask about my frayed tweed jacket or the grease stains on Marcus's heavy canvas coat. He simply adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and compared the crumpled paper time cards to the bank deposit screenshots. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, marking the heavy silence in the room. "This is not a simple accounting error," Arthur concluded, his voice clinical and calm. "This is systematic wage theft. But to prove a legal pattern, we need more than just 5 angry kitchen workers. We need someone who actually saw the manager portal from the inside." "I already took care of that," Marcus said. The massive mechanic leaned against the boardroom wall, crossing his thick arms. "I called Chloe this morning, and she agreed to meet us here." I remembered Chloe vividly. She was a bright, quiet girl who took my small business management class a decade ago. She had worked as the assistant manager for the restaurant group for 2 years before quitting abruptly last winter. The boardroom door opened with a soft click, and Chloe walked in. She wore a heavy wool coat, looking exhausted but fiercely determined. She took a seat next to me, placing a thick manila folder on the polished wood table. "I saved absolutely everything," Chloe whispered, opening the cardboard folder. "I tried to tell the corporate office last year, but my emails were intercepted. When I realized the general manager was entirely untouchable, I started printing the point-of-sale tip reports every single Friday before anyone could alter them." Arthur leaned forward, picking up the top sheet of paper. "The cash tips were withheld?" Chloe nodded, her hands shaking slightly as she pointed to a long column of printed numbers. "Lauren took 30% of the server tip pool and claimed it was for mandatory breakage fees. Afterward, the manager portal allowed her to manually adjust the kitchen overtime. Every single fraudulent edit is stamped with that specific authorization code, LM01. "Did anyone delete the master audit logs?" Raymond asked. The older man looked physically sick, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom. "No," Chloe replied. "The master system remained completely untouched. The general manager told me that kitchen workers were far too uneducated to read a pay stub. The corporate investors only cared about profit margins. So my former boss believed absolutely nobody would ever bother to compare the two distinct systems. Arrogance is always a quiet, creeping poison. My daughter-in-law had built an empire of glass, completely convinced that the people beneath her lacked the strength to throw a single stone. She left a perfect digital trail of her crimes simply because she thought we were beneath her notice. The physical evidence was devastating, but Raymond needed to hear the lie directly from his own blood before he completely destroyed her career. The wealthy investor pulled his cell phone from his coat pocket and placed it squarely on the mahogany table. He pressed the speaker button and dialed the restaurant's main office line. The phone rang twice before a familiar, sharp voice filled the quiet boardroom. "This is Lauren," she answered, the background noise of clattering pans echoing through the tiny speaker. "Make it quick, Dad! The health inspector is coming this afternoon, and my useless staff is barely keeping the kitchen together." My jaw tightened. Arthur simply picked up a silver pen and began taking rapid notes on a yellow legal pad. "Lauren," Raymond said, forcing his voice to remain perfectly steady despite his visible anger. "I was just looking over the quarterly financial reports. Our labor costs are incredibly low, almost impossibly low. Are you absolutely sure the payroll software is calculating the overtime correctly?" A sharp, condescending laugh came through the speaker. "Of course it is correct. I manage every single cent personally. The reason our costs are low is because I actually know how to run a kitchen efficiently. Unlike your old friend Eugene, I do not waste my valuable time coddling these people." "So you are not adjusting their hours manually?" Raymond pressed, his fingers gripping the edge of the heavy table until his knuckles turned bone white. "Do not be ridiculous," Lauren snapped, her tone dripping with annoyance. "The system is entirely automated. I just approve the final numbers at the end of the week. Listen, Dad, I have to go. The prep cooks are moving way too slowly, and I need to threaten them with a pay cut if they want to keep their jobs for the massive anniversary weekend." The line went completely dead. The dial tone echoed in the boardroom, loud and unforgiving. Raymond closed his eyes. The last shred of hope he held for his only daughter vanished into the quiet room. He picked up his phone, slowly sliding it back into his deep coat pocket. "My own child lied right to my face," the older man whispered, staring blindly at the wooden table. "And that woman just admitted to threatening illegal pay cuts on a recorded corporate line," Arthur pointed out, tapping his silver pen against the legal pad. In my state, this specific office phone records all incoming and outgoing calls for strict legal compliance. We now have documented wage theft, printed audit logs showing her exact manager code, the group text message demanding unpaid labor, and a recorded verbal threat. I looked at the mountain of paper covering the table. The lives of my former students were buried deep in those cold numbers. Rent money they could not pay, groceries they had to put back on the shelf. Hours of their youth stolen by a woman who simply wanted a slightly larger bonus at the end of the fiscal year. What happens next? I asked, looking directly at the sharp attorney. Arthur gathered the printed schedules, the point-of-sale reports, and the photographs of the text messages. He slid them into a thick leather portfolio and stood up from his tall chair. A private lawsuit could take years. The strongest path is to submit every piece of evidence directly to the State Labor Board. Let the investigators secure the digital records before anyone has a chance to alter them. Once the administrative findings are complete, the corporation can make its own employment decisions based on those findings, the lawyer explained. His tone was sharp, calculating, and completely void of mercy. A private lawsuit takes years, and the defendant could easily settle out of court to keep her public reputation intact. We are not going to give her that comfortable option. Marcus stepped away from the wall, a hard, satisfied smile forming on his weathered face. So, where are we taking this evidence? The State Labor Board, Arthur said, snapping the leather portfolio shut with a loud crack. I have a personal contact in the investigative division. This is a crystal-clear case of systemic payroll fraud and vicious employee retaliation. If I submit this packet directly to the Inspector General today, they will not even wait for a subpoena. Raymond stood up, buttoning his long wool coat. The crushing grief had completely left his expression, replaced entirely by the cold, ruthless demeanor of a man who built a massive commercial empire from nothing. Do it, Raymond commanded. Submit the file right now. Arthur nodded respectfully. He picked up the desk phone and dialed a state government number. This is Arthur Vance, the lawyer said into the receiver. I need to speak to the chief labor inspector immediately. I have a massive wage theft case, and the target is actively manipulating evidence at a commercial family restaurant as we speak. I walked over to the wide glass window, looking down at the busy city streets below. The rain had started to fall again, washing the gray pavement clean. Lauren thought she had won last night when she threw me out the back door in front of my own son. She had absolutely no idea that by this afternoon, the full weight of the state government would be walking right through her front entrance. The smell of industrial lemon cleaner hung heavy in the main dining room, entirely failing to mask the sharp scent of roasted garlic drifting from the back. 2 o'clock in the afternoon usually meant quiet prep work for a restaurant of this size. But today, the air felt completely different. Raymond pushed open the heavy glass front doors, walking straight past the closed sign hanging in the window. I followed him inside, my worn boots completely silent against the freshly mopped tile. A woman in a sharp gray suit stood by the host's stand. Agent Miller from the State Labor Board carried a thick black briefcase and a metal clipboard. 2 younger investigators in matching jackets stood right behind her, holding sealed plastic evidence bags. Mr. Vance, Miller said, nodding respectfully to Raymond. My team is already inside the manager office. We pulled the master audit logs from the main server 10 minutes ago, and we are matching them against the point-of-sale tip records right now. Before Raymond could answer, the swinging doors to the kitchen flew open. Lauren marched into the dining room, her heels clicking aggressively against the floorboards. The restaurant manager clutched a stack of inventory sheets to her chest. She saw her father first, her face lighting up with a frantic, desperate relief. Then her eyes locked onto me standing right beside him. What is he doing here? Lauren demanded, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. And why are government agents tearing apart my filing cabinets? Dad, you need to call your corporate lawyers right now and get these people out of my building. Raymond did not blink. The wealthy investor kept his hands buried deep in his wool coat pockets, standing as still as a statue. My lawyers are the ones who filed the complaint this morning, Lauren. The color completely drained from her face. The heavy inventory sheets slipped from her hands, scattering across the polished floor. She looked from her father to the stern federal agent, and finally, she seemed to realize the trap had already snapped shut. But a cornered animal never just surrenders, and I knew she would try to tear someone down before she fell. Agent Miller ignored the scattered papers and directed her attention toward the kitchen. I need to speak with the prep staff. We have sworn affidavits from 5 employees, but I need to conduct the on-site interviews before the dinner shift begins. The investigator walked toward a row of corner booths, signaling for Elias and 3 other young cooks to sit down. The boys stepped out of the kitchen slowly. They still wore their white aprons, their hands shoved into their pockets. They looked terrified, surrounded by government badges and the furious glare of their boss. I walked over to the wooden booth before the agent could sit down. Elias gripped a small kitchen towel in his hands, twisting the fabric so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Tell her the exact truth, Elias," I said quietly, resting my hand on the edge of the table. "Do not exaggerate. Do not leave a single detail out. You answer her questions honestly, and then you go back to the kitchen and do your job like a professional." "But, Mr. Mercer," Elias whispered, his eyes darting across the room. "She is standing right there." Lauren crossed the dining room before I could reassure him, her voice rising to a frantic, piercing pitch. "This is your fault, Eugene. You poisoned my staff against me. You filled their heads with absolute lies because you are jealous of David, and you just want to ruin our massive anniversary dinner." My jaw tightened. 40 years of teaching had trained me to recognize a bully losing control of the room, and the best response was always a quiet, immovable wall. "Your staff is speaking to a state investigator because you stole their wages," I replied, holding her furious gaze without raising my voice a single decibel. "I am just here to make sure they do not have to do it alone." Agent Miller stepped squarely between us. The investigator held up a stack of printed payroll documents, her expression completely devoid of patience. "Miss Mercer, you need to step away from the witnesses," Miller ordered, her tone slicing through the tense room. "Right now. If you attempt to intimidate these employees or interfere with this active investigation, I will have the local police remove you from the premises in handcuffs." Lauren took a slow step backward. Her breathing sounded ragged in the quiet dining room. The general manager finally turned away, retreating toward the empty bar, to watch the proceedings with a cold, venomous glare. 2 hours passed in agonizingly slow increments. The afternoon sun began to dip lower, casting long, dark shadows across the empty tables. The smell of roasting meat grew stronger as the kitchen desperately tried to prepare for the massive evening event. Raymond sat in a chair by the window, staring blankly at the street outside, mourning the complete destruction of his daughter's integrity. Finally, Agent Miller packed her thick files into the black briefcase and snapped the metal locks shut. She walked over to where Raymond and I were standing. "The physical testimonies perfectly match the deleted overtime logs," the investigator announced, keeping her voice low but firm. "This is a massive, systemic violation of state labor laws. We have everything we need to build an airtight prosecution." Raymond slowly stood up. "So, you are shutting the restaurant down." "I cannot shut your doors today, Mr. Vance," Miller explained, adjusting the strap of her heavy bag. "The official citations, the financial penalties, and the mandate to suspend management take 24 hours to process through the state legal system. I have to submit this packet to a judge tomorrow morning. Legally, she is still allowed to operate the business tonight." I looked across the room. Lauren was standing near the bar, and she had clearly heard the investigator. A sharp, triumphant smile touched the corners of her mouth. She let out a heavy breath of relief, entirely convinced she had survived the worst of the storm. My daughter-in-law genuinely believed she could still force these young men to cook for her wealthy corporate sponsors tonight, simply because the government paperwork moved too slowly to stop her. The state agents walked out the front doors, leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. Lauren immediately picked up her clipboard, her confidence completely restored by the legal delay, and stormed back toward the kitchen to bark orders at the prep team. The state would not shut the restaurant down today, but as I watched Elias and the other young cooks exchange quiet, resolute glances near the swinging doors, the truth became perfectly clear. The government would not have to do a single thing. The 5-year anniversary dinner was only 3 hours away, and the kitchen staff was preparing to deliver a verdict of their own. The roar of the packed dining room vibrated through the floorboards. 7 o'clock on a Friday night brought a loud collision of clinking crystal glasses, heavy laughter, and the steady hum of wealthy corporate sponsors celebrating the 5-year anniversary of the restaurant. Raymond and I sat at a small corner table near the swinging doors. We did not order food. We just watched the frantic rhythm of a business teetering on the edge of a massive cliff. Every time a server pushed open the heavy wooden doors, a blast of blistering heat and the sharp smell of seared steak rolled into the air-conditioned room. The kitchen was operating at absolute maximum capacity. Order tickets hung in a dense white line above the prep stations. Lauren stormed through the kitchen doors, her silk dress entirely out of place among the stainless steel counters and industrial ovens. A frantic energy radiated from her every movement. She snatched a long strip of printed tickets from the machine, waving the paper directly in the face of the head chef. Table 4 needs their appetizers right now, Thomas, Lauren snapped, her voice cutting through the hiss of the fryers. She paced behind the line of cooks, stopping right behind Elias. And listen to me, all of you. The state investigators might think they have a case, but my father owns this building. Nothing changes tonight. In fact, the entire prep team is staying 3 hours after closing to deep clean the walk-in freezer. You can consider it mandatory, unpaid volunteer work to make up for the absolute circus you caused this afternoon. My hands curled into fists under the table. She was completely unhinged, high on the adrenaline of a packed house, and entirely blind to the quiet storm brewing right in front of her. Elias did not look up from his cutting board. The young cook simply chopped a handful of parsley, his knife moving with practiced, rhythmic precision. Next to him, Thomas grabbed a hot pan from the burner. The veteran head chef expertly plated a massive cut of prime rib, wiping the edge of the white porcelain until it was perfectly spotless. He slid the heavy plate onto the pickup window and tapped the metal bell twice. Then, Thomas reached behind his back. He untied the thick knot of his white apron. The heavy fabric slipped down his chest, pooling onto the greasy floor tiles. "Pick that up," Lauren commanded, pointing a trembling finger at the dirty fabric. "You have 20 open tickets on the board, Thomas." "I am completely finished," the head chef said. His voice was not loud, but the absolute calm in his tone made the entire kitchen stop moving. "I made sure the food on the fire was plated so the customers would not suffer. But I am not working another minute off the clock, and I am certainly not working for a thief." Lauren let out a sharp, breathless laugh, looking around the room as if waiting for a punchline. "You cannot walk out in the middle of an anniversary dinner. I will ruin your career in this city. I will make sure you never work in a commercial kitchen again." Thomas picked up his knife case, snapping the metal latches shut. "You do not have a career left to threaten me with." The head chef walked past her, pushing open the back exit door and stepping out into the cold night. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the hot kitchen. The only sound left was the relentless clicking of the ticket machine, spitting out more orders. Lauren spun around, her eyes wide with sudden, genuine panic. She looked directly at Elias. "Take over the grill station right now. If you step up, I will promote you to sous chef tomorrow morning. Double your salary." Elias carefully wiped his chef knife with a clean towel. He placed the blade gently onto the magnetic strip on the wall. He looked through the glass window of the swinging doors, meeting my eyes from across the dining room. I stood up from my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. I took a step toward the kitchen, intending to tell them to hold their ground and keep their jobs. We already had the legal evidence to destroy her. They did not need to sacrifice their own paychecks just to defend my honor. But Elias saw me coming, and the young man slowly shook his head. "You taught us how to build engines, Mr. Mercer," Elias called out, his voice carrying clearly through the open serving window. "You taught us to take pride in the work of our own 2 hands. But you also taught us not to let anyone treat us like we are disposable." The young cook reached behind his neck and pulled the apron over his head. He dropped it directly onto the cutting board. "I am done," Elias announced. The kid next to him, a quiet boy named Julian, immediately unknotted his own apron. The fabric hit the floor. Then, the pastry chef stepped away from her station. The dishwasher turned off the massive commercial sink, wiping his wet hands on his jeans before grabbing his coat. "Stop!" Lauren screamed, grabbing Elias by the shoulder of his white uniform. "You cannot do this to me. The investors are sitting right out there. You owe me this shift." Elias gently but firmly pulled his shoulder out of her grip. "We do not owe you anything. You already stole it." One by one, 7 kitchen workers walked in a single file line toward the back door. Nobody shouted, nobody threw anything. The absolute silence of their departure was far more devastating than any screaming match could ever be. They simply removed their labor, leaving the grand empire entirely hollow. I stopped moving, standing frozen just outside the kitchen doors. The realization washed over me like cold water. They were not doing this just to avenge a humiliated old teacher. They were doing it for their own dignity. They had finally recognized their own immense value, and they refused to give it to someone who only saw them as numbers on a spreadsheet. Raymond stepped up beside me, leaning heavily on his wooden cane. The wealthy corporate owner stared through the glass pane, watching his only daughter standing completely alone in the center of the massive kitchen. Lauren was surrounded by bubbling pots, sizzling grills, and a machine violently spitting out a dozen new order tickets. She looked frantically from the empty stations to the mountain of raw meat waiting on the prep tables. Her hands shook violently. She reached for a pair of metal tongs, dropping them instantly when the hot metal burned her palm. Out in the dining room, a guest sharply rang a glass with a silver spoon, demanding the attention of a server. A low murmur of impatience started to ripple through the wealthy crowd. Lauren backed away from the hot stoves, bumping into the stainless steel refrigerator. She slowly slid down to the greasy floor, burying her face in her hands as the ticket machine continued to print, creating a long, white paper trail of promises she could no longer keep. The heavy iron padlock rattled against the front doors of the restaurant. I stood on the wet sidewalk, pulling my tweed collar up against the biting autumn wind. The massive front windows were completely dark. A simple piece of white printer paper was taped to the glass, declaring the business temporarily closed due to unforeseen maintenance. That was a polite corporate lie. The truth was far more devastating. The kitchen had no staff, and an empire built on stolen labor simply could not function without its victims. Raymond waited for me in his idling luxury sedan parked at the curb. I climbed into the warm leather interior, and the driver immediately pulled away, heading toward the towering glass buildings of the financial district. 10 minutes later, we sat in Raymond's cavernous executive suite. The smell of expensive dark roast coffee hung in the air, mixing with the sharp scent of polished mahogany. A thick cream envelope rested in the center of the desk. The official seal of the State Labor Board was pressed into the corner. "Read it, teacher," the corporate patriarch said. He sank heavily into his chair, rubbing the deep lines across his forehead. I picked up the official packet. The state investigator had worked through the weekend. The crisp pages detailed systematic wage theft, unauthorized time card manipulation, and vicious employee retaliation. The legal mandate was crystal clear. The government was freezing the restaurant operating accounts pending a full financial audit. "The corporate bank called me at dawn," Raymond explained, pouring 2 glasses of sparkling water. The crystal clinked sharply in the quiet room. "They are threatening to call in our commercial loans because Lauren triggered a major liability clause. Our primary meat vendors watched the kitchen staff walk out on Friday night, and now they refuse to deliver a single steak on credit. We are hemorrhaging cash every single hour those doors stay locked." The heavy glass door to the office swung open without a single knock. David marched in, shaking the cold rain from his expensive trench coat. My son looked absolutely awful. Dark circles bruised the pale skin under his eyes, and his usually perfect hair was frantic and uncombed. He stopped dead when he saw me standing by the wide window. "What is he doing here?" David demanded, his voice tight and defensive. "Lauren is at home having a complete nervous breakdown. She has not slept in 3 days, and you are up here plotting with her father." "Take a seat, David," Raymond ordered. The older man did not raise his voice, but the absolute authority in his tone left no room for debate. "Your wife brought this catastrophe down on her own head." My son stubbornly remained standing, gripping the back of a leather guest chair. "It was a computer glitch. That is what she told the investor group yesterday. The payroll software duplicated the deductions, and those ungrateful kids took advantage of an honest mistake to ruin our biggest night." I walked over to the desk and picked up a single sheet of paper. It was not the polished government report, but rather the raw audit log Chloe had provided, the exact digital footprint of the theft. I had waited 5 years for my son to defend me, but right now, I just needed him to finally open his eyes. "An automated computer glitch does not type out a manual authorization code," I said quietly, sliding the document across the polished wood. "I want you to look at the highlighted column, David, right there." David reluctantly looked down. His tired eyes tracked the long line of numbers. The defensive posture slowly drained out of his shoulders as he read the undeniable proof. The paper clearly showed his wife logging into the system every single Friday at midnight. She manually erased the overtime hours, and then she approved the brutal cuts using her personal manager identification code. "She did this by hand," David whispered, his voice cracking violently. David stared at the audit trail for a long moment. Suddenly, forgotten conversations came rushing back. Kitchen workers quietly quitting without explanation. Lauren insisting turnover was normal, and every family dinner where she proudly celebrated shrinking labor costs. The warning signs had always been there. The only reason he never saw them was because looking away had been easier. He picked up the page, his fingers trembling so hard the paper rattled in the quiet room 50 different times. "She stole their money right before she came home to sleep. She stole from the boys I taught to rebuild engines," I added, refusing to soften the blow. "Young men who worked 14-hour shifts over hot fryers just to pay their rent. And when I tried to help them fix a broken oven, she threw me out the back door while you stared at your expensive shoes. The truth finally shattered the last of his carefully constructed illusions. David dropped heavily into the leather chair, burying his face in his hands. The polished, successful facade he had maintained for years was entirely gone. He was left with the crushing reality of what he had enabled through his own cowardly silence. Raymond stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket. The wealthy investor looked down at his son-in-law with a mixture of pity and profound disappointment. The public relations team drafted a press release this morning, Raymond announced, tapping a separate folder on the desk. I am releasing a formal statement to the local media at noon. I am publicly apologizing to the kitchen staff, the community, and specifically to Eugene. David looked up, his face pale and stricken. The press? Raymond, if you go public with this, the scandal will destroy Lauren completely. She will never work in corporate management again. That is exactly the point, the corporate patriarch replied, his voice dropping to a cold, unforgiving register. She built a sweatshop inside my family business. I will not cover up her crimes just to protect her fragile ego. Raymond turned his attention back to me, extending a weathered hand. I took it, feeling the firm, respectful grip of a man who finally remembered the exact lessons he learned 38 years ago in a dusty vocational workshop. The corporate board of directors is meeting tomorrow morning at 9, Raymond declared, picking up his heavy coat. I am calling for a strict vote of no confidence. We are permanently stripping Lauren of her title, her salary, and her access to the properties. My son sat paralyzed in the tall chair, staring blindly at the damning audit trail scattered across the mahogany desk. The empire his wife had ruthlessly built was burning to the ground, and the final judgment was only hours away. The harsh glare of television camera lights cut through the damp afternoon air, illuminating the red brick facade of the downtown community center. Shutter clicks snapped like a swarm of locusts over the quiet murmur of the gathered crowd. A sharp scent of wet asphalt and hot coffee lingered around the concrete steps where Raymond stood behind a wooden podium. The wealthy corporate patriarch adjusted the microphone. He did not look like a man defending an empire. He looked like a father publicly dismantling one. This morning, the State Labor Board concluded their preliminary investigation into the management of our flagship restaurant, Raymond announced. His rough voice echoed over the portable speakers, cutting through the biting wind. The findings are severe, and they are entirely undeniable. A local reporter from the Channel 5 news station pushed her voice recorder closer. Mr. Vance, can you confirm the specific allegations of systemic wage theft? I confirm them, the older man stated firmly. A collective gasp rippled through the press pool. But Raymond did not flinch. My general manager engaged in deliberate, calculated payroll fraud. She stole overtime wages from the kitchen staff and illegally withheld point-of-sale tips. The corporate audit logs prove every single allegation. He paused, letting the heavy silence settle over the crowd. His knuckles turned white against the edges of the wooden podium. Then, he looked directly into the camera lenses. That manager is my daughter, Lauren Mercer. And as of tomorrow morning, she will face the absolute maximum penalties allowed by law. I stood near the back of the crowd, keeping my hands buried deep in my tweed jacket pockets. Elias and Thomas stood right beside me. They were flanked by Marcus and nearly 50 other former students. Mechanics, plumbers, electricians, and carpenters wore their heavy work boots and canvas jackets, standing shoulder to shoulder in silent solidarity. They formed a physical wall around the young kitchen workers. A young journalist noticed our group and turned his microphone toward me. Mr. Mercer, the leaked video showed your daughter-in-law throwing you out of the kitchen. Do you feel vindicated seeing her public downfall? I looked at the young reporter, ignoring the flashing cameras blinding my vision. This is not about my personal pride, and it is certainly not about revenge. A bruised ego heals in a day, but stolen wages mean missed rent payments and empty grocery carts for hard-working people. The focus belongs exactly where those stolen hours went. Marcus stepped forward, his massive frame shielding Elias from the aggressive press corps. The mechanic pulled a folded piece of white paper from his pocket, raising his voice to ensure the microphones picked up every single syllable. The kitchen staff walked out on Friday night to protect their own dignity, Marcus declared loudly. But standing up for yourself does not pay the bills. That is why the local business community, along with 36 alumni from Mr. Mercer's vocational program, established a transition fund this morning. The towering mechanic unfolded the thick paper. We raised $60,000 in 4 hours. Every single worker who walked out of that restaurant will receive their full lost wages and a paid month off, while the corporate board figures out how to clean up this massive disaster. Elias looked up at Marcus, his mouth opening in stunned silence. Julian, the quiet prep cook standing near the back, wiped roughly at his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket. They had expected to face eviction notices this week. Instead, an entire city had built a fortress around them. Up on the concrete steps, Raymond gathered the thick stack of printed audit logs into his leather portfolio. A true legacy is measured by the people you lift up, the corporate owner said softly, echoing the exact words I had taught him almost 4 decades ago in a dusty basement workshop. My family forgot that critical lesson, but this community did not. The press conference ended shortly after, and the local news vans immediately began packing up their heavy equipment. The story would dominate the evening broadcasts, playing the undeniable proof of Lauren's guilt across every television screen in the county. Her carefully curated public image was dead. The flawless family brand she peddled on social media was completely shattered by the hard, undeniable truth. However, public shame was only the first step. The structural power of the corporation still remained in the balance, and a damaged ego makes a desperate opponent. The following morning arrived with a bitter, freezing rain. I stood in the massive lobby of the central financial high-rise, staring at our reflections in the polished marble walls. David stood near the elevator banks, his hands shaking violently as he clutched a leather briefcase. My son had not spoken a single word since we walked through the revolving glass doors. He looked completely broken, finally carrying the crushing weight of his own silence. The brass elevator chimed sharply, breaking the heavy tension in the lobby. The heavy metal doors slid open, revealing the top-floor executive suite. We walked down the long, carpeted hallway, stopping just outside the frosted glass of the main meeting room. The entire corporate board of directors waited around a massive mahogany table. Their faces were completely devoid of mercy, their eyes fixed on the empty chair at the center of the room. Raymond sat at the head of the long table, resting his hands on the thick state labor board report. He looked up, gesturing for us to enter. The public truth had completely destroyed her reputation, but the final, devastating judgment was about to begin. The frosted glass doors clicked shut behind us, sealing off the busy hallway noise. The air conditioning in the executive suite blew cold against my neck, carrying the faint scent of lemon polish and expensive leather. 12 men and women in dark, tailored suits sat around a massive mahogany table. Their expressions were carved from stone, completely unreadable as Raymond took his seat at the head of the room. David collapsed into a chair near the corner. My son kept his head down, staring blankly at the intricate wood grain of the table. Then, the side door opened, and Lauren walked in. My daughter-in-law wore a sharp black blazer, her chin held high to project a fierce confidence she clearly did not feel. Taking a seat opposite her father, the former restaurant manager folded her hands neatly over her leather portfolio. She absolutely refused to look in my direction, keeping her gaze locked on the state labor report resting in front of Raymond. The state investigator submitted her final findings at dawn, the corporate patriarch announced. His rough voice echoed in the cavernous room, leaving no space for pleasantries. The government froze the operating accounts of our flagship restaurant. We lost all vendor credit overnight, and the entire kitchen staff resigned. This corporation is bleeding capital, and the source of the wound is sitting right at this table. Lauren sat perfectly straight. It was a minor accounting oversight, Dad. My legal team can settle the fines by Friday, and we can simply hire a new prep team before the weekend dinner rush. A heavy silence fell over the board members. Several of them exchanged cold, calculating glances. It was not an oversight, Lauren, Raymond replied, his tone dropping to a quiet, terrifying whisper. You manually altered the payroll logs to steal wages from young people who barely make enough to survive. You threatened those same kids on a recorded phone line. You destroyed the reputation of a family business that took me 40 years to build. The young woman opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat when she finally looked at the faces around the table. There was no sympathy to manipulate, and there were no blind spots left to exploit. Before Raymond could call for a formal motion, a chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. David stood up. My son gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his fingers trembled. His tailored suit looked completely rumpled, and his eyes were red from a total lack of sleep. He looked at his wife, and then he slowly turned his attention to me. I knew something was wrong, David confessed, his voice cracking into the quiet room. I saw the high turnover in the kitchen. I heard the young cooks complaining about missing money last year. I chose to look the other way because the profit margins were so incredibly high, and I wanted the board to think we were successful. Lauren stared at him, her eyes wide with sudden panic. David, sit down and stop talking right now. I let my own father get thrown out into a freezing alley just to protect your lies, David continued, completely ignoring her command. He let go of the table and took a slow breath. I enabled a thief, and I am entirely responsible for my own silence. I am so sorry, Dad. A quiet warmth settled in my chest. For the first time in 5 years, the boy I had raised by myself was finally standing up in the harsh light of reality. I gave him a single, slow nod, accepting the apology, without needing to say a single word. Raymond tapped his silver pen against the wood, bringing the room back to absolute attention. The executive board will now vote, the older man declared. All in favor of immediately terminating Lauren Mercer as general manager, stripping her of all operational authority, corporate salary, and access to company properties, please raise your hand. A long silence settled over the boardroom. One director slowly closed the investigation report and looked around the table. Given the documented payroll fraud, the operational damage, and our fiduciary duty to the corporation, I don't believe we have another responsible option. One by one, hands began to rise, until every director had voted in favor. Raymond raised his hand last. Casting the final, undeniable judgment against his own child. The motion passes unanimously, Raymond announced. He closed the thick file. Security is waiting in the hallway. They will escort you to your office to collect your personal items. Lauren, you are permanently banned from the restaurant. The former manager stood up slowly. The flawless mask of the wealthy corporate boss finally shattered, leaving behind a terrified woman who suddenly realized she had absolutely nothing left. She looked at her father, pleading silently for a rescue that was never going to come. When Raymond simply turned his face toward the window, Lauren picked up her empty portfolio and walked out of the room. The heavy door clicked shut, finalizing her exile. An interim management firm takes over the property at noon, Raymond told the remaining board members. They will release the back pay owed to the kitchen staff immediately. We are inviting every single worker to return under a completely new union contract. Then, the corporate owner looked directly at me. Eugene, Raymond said, his tone softening considerably. The kitchen staff trusts you implicitly. The board would like to offer you a paid position as our senior operational consultant. We also want to grant you a minor equity stake in the restaurant to properly compensate you for the damage done to your students. I looked around the expensive boardroom, taking in the mahogany walls and the crystal water glasses. It was an incredibly generous offer, and it would provide a comfortable income for the rest of my life. I decline, I said quietly. A murmur of surprise rippled through the seated executives, but Raymond simply tilted his head, waiting for my explanation. I am a vocational teacher, Raymond, I explained, buttoning my old tweed jacket, not a restaurateur. My students did not walk out on Friday night just to give an old man a new corporate job. They walked out to claim their own immense worth. You do not need me to watch over them anymore, because they finally learned how to watch over themselves. Raymond leaned back in his leather chair. A genuine, incredibly tired smile touched the corners of his mouth. You always did know exactly when to let your students graduate, teacher. The formal meeting adjourned shortly after. The board members filed out into the hallway, leaving their coffee cups on the long table. Within 10 minutes, the massive executive suite was entirely empty, save for the 3 men who started this ordeal in a freezing alley. The legal business was officially settled, but the family was still completely shattered. David remained standing by the corner chair. He looked up at the ceiling, fighting back tears. My marriage is over. The restaurant is in chaos. Where do we even go from here? I walked over to the heavy wooden door, placing my hand on the brass handle. We have one last conversation, David. Just the 3 of us, without the corporate lawyers and without the board of directors. The quiet coffee shop across from the corporate tower smelled like burnt toast and stale bleach. Raymond sat across from me in a cracked vinyl booth, and David sat right beside him. My son stirred his black coffee for a long time, watching the steam rise from the ceramic mug before he finally spoke. She packed her bags this morning, David said quietly. My son did not look angry anymore, just incredibly tired. The state labor board hit her with massive personal administrative fines, and since the corporate attorneys refused to represent her, she has to pay for her own defense. She moved into a small rental apartment across town. The former manager retained her corporate shares because the law protects financial ownership. But a stock certificate is just a piece of paper, and a piece of paper cannot keep you warm in an empty house. That woman traded her own family for a few extra dollars on a spreadsheet, and now she had absolutely no one left to order around. Her reputation in the city was completely destroyed. "You are going to be fine, David," I told him, placing my weathered hand over his on the sticky table. "You have a lot of rebuilding to do, but you are not doing it alone." My son looked up, and for the first time in 5 years, the heavy, suffocating guilt was completely gone from his eyes. 4 weeks passed before the heavy iron padlocks finally came off the restaurant doors. The late November air carried a sharp, bitter chill as I walked down the familiar downtown street. Yellow leaves scattered across the wet pavement, blowing past the massive glass windows of the newly renovated dining room. Raymond had kept his promise to the community. The corporate board replaced the hostile management team, instituted a transparent payroll system, and invited the entire kitchen staff back with a massive pay raise and a union contract. I pushed open the front doors, stepping into a wall of warm air and the rich smell of roasting garlic. The dining room was absolutely packed. Waiters navigated the narrow spaces between tables, carrying heavy trays of steaming food and crystal water pitchers. I stood near the host stand, perfectly content to stay out of the way and watch the relentless rhythm of a successful dinner rush. "Mr. Mercer." The voice came from the swinging wooden doors. Elias stood there, wearing a pristine white chef coat. The young man looked taller, his shoulders pulled back with a quiet, solid confidence. He did not look like a frightened kid hiding in a pantry anymore. He walked across the busy dining room and wrapped his arms around my shoulders in a tight embrace. "We saved a corner table for you in the back," the newly promoted sous chef said, stepping back with a wide smile. "Thomas made the brisket exactly the way you like it." I followed Elias through the busy restaurant, nodding to Julian and the other boys working the hotline behind the glass partition. They did not stop cooking to cheer or make a massive scene. The cooks simply raised a pair of metal tongs or gave a quick, respectful nod before returning to their sizzling pans. That was exactly how it was supposed to be. They were true professionals, taking immense pride in the work of their own two hands. But the most important event of the evening was still waiting in the dining room. Raymond waited at a quiet booth near the back corner. The corporate patriarch wore a simple gray sweater, looking completely relaxed as he took a sip of his sparkling water. David sat right next to him, laughing at a joke one of the passing servers made. The thick tension that used to choke this family had completely evaporated, leaving behind something honest and incredibly real. Before I could sit down, the head chef tapped a metal spoon against a water glass. The sharp ringing cut through the dining room noise, and the entire restaurant slowly fell quiet. Thomas stepped out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a clean white towel. He gestured toward our corner booth. Raymond slowly stood up, leaning heavily on his wooden cane. The wealthy investor looked around the room, making direct eye contact with the young men in the kitchen, the servers on the floor, and finally settling his gaze entirely on me. 38 years ago, a man caught me making a terrible mistake in a dusty basement, Raymond said, his rough voice carrying clearly across the silent tables. Instead of punishing me, he handed me a set of blueprints. He taught me that the true measure of a successful life is never how many people work beneath you. It is how many people you lift up alongside you. The older man reached out, placing his hand firmly on David's shoulder. "I forgot that critical lesson when I raised my daughter," Raymond continued, his tone thick with sudden emotion. "And it almost cost me everything I built. But this restaurant did not survive because of corporate money. It survived because the people who actually do the hard work refuse to surrender their dignity. You kept this place alive, and you honored the man who taught us all how to stand tall." A warm, genuine round of applause broke out across the dining room. Elias clapped Thomas on the back, and Julian smiled widely from the grill station. They were not just employees anymore. They were the absolute foundation of the business. I sat down in the leather booth, pulling my worn tweed jacket off my shoulders. David pushed a hot cup of black coffee across the table, offering a quiet, grateful smile. Through the large glass partition, I watched Elias pull a new, terrified teenage dishwasher aside. The young sous chef patiently demonstrated how to load the massive commercial machine without burning his hands, using the exact same calm, steady tone I used in my vocational classes decades ago. You cannot take a restaurant with you when you die, and a bank account is just a collection of cold numbers on a screen. But when you teach a kid how to build something strong, they eventually turn around and teach someone else. That chain of quiet, stubborn dignity stretches on forever, and absolutely nobody can ever steal it away. When you look back at the heavy wooden doors of that restaurant, you realize that the foundation of any lasting empire is never made of brick, glass, or corporate money. It is made entirely of the people standing inside it. You might be sitting at your own kitchen table right now, wondering if the years you spent building a home, raising a family, or supporting a career actually meant anything. You might have a relative, a boss, or a daughter-in-law who looks right past your sacrifices, treating you like you are completely invisible. The world is full of people who measure success purely by the balance in a checking account or the impressive title printed on a sleek business card. They will look at your worn jacket, your gray hair, or your calloused hands and try to convince you that your time has passed. They will try to make you feel completely useless, simply because your value does not fit neatly onto their quarterly profit spreadsheet. But you have to remember that true legacy is never loud. It does not demand a microphone, and it certainly does not force people to bow their heads in fear. True legacy is the quiet, stubborn dignity you pass down to the people around you every single day. When you choose to lift someone up, when you teach them a skill, or when you show them how to recognize their own immense worth, you are planting roots that will easily outlive any commercial business. You might not see the harvest for 10, 20, or even 38 years. Yet, when the heavy storms inevitably come, and when the arrogant people of the world try to push you out into the freezing cold, you will suddenly find that you are completely surrounded by a fortress of the very same people you once protected. The respect you give away freely becomes an invisible shield when you need it the most. On the other hand, if you choose to build your life using fear, intimidation, and stolen wages to construct a flawless public mask, you are only building a fragile house of cards. You can manipulate the financial logs, threaten the vulnerable, and demand absolute loyalty from the people who depend on your paycheck. But forced loyalty evaporates the exact second people realize they have a choice. The moment you treat human beings as disposable tools, you strip away your own foundation. And when the hard truth finally comes to light, all the expensive suits, corner offices, and wealthy investors in the world cannot save you from the crushing reality of standing entirely alone. Your worth is determined by the lives you touch and the integrity you maintain when absolutely nobody is looking. You do not need a fancy corporate title to be a teacher, a leader, or a deeply respected member of your own family. You just need to show up, do the right thing, and absolutely refuse to let anyone tell you that your quiet contributions do not matter. The respect you earn through genuine kindness is the only currency that never loses its absolute value. Have you ever poured your heart into your family or your life work, only to be dismissed or made to feel completely invisible by someone who could not see your true value? How did you find the strength to hold on to your personal dignity and prove them wrong? And who were the unexpected people that finally stood up to remind you of your own incredible worth? Please share your personal story in the comments below, because your specific experience might be exactly what someone else desperately needs to hear today.